Okay, we are live. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Super Politics. We have a very special episode today. We're joined with your co-host, Decatur Brent. This is Steve Daly. This one is actually a very special episode. If you go onto our Patreon, we actually are recording this one with video through Zoom, so you can see how hot we are. I know you've been wondering.
Yeah, I've been working up this stash for a long time for you.
Yeah, we couldn't do video until his mustache was set. So now that it's locked in, we're live.
Yeah.
So we're gonna throw this up on our Patreon to get the video version. Today we have a really awesome thing happening on our podcast, and we have a guest, an interview today with author and journalist and columnist Ellis Cose. And this individual, he's really, really awesome. I've been reading a lot about him lately. As soon as we started talking to him about coming on the show, he was a columnist for 17 years for Newsweek magazine. He was a chairman and editorial page editor of the New York Daily News. He was an independent radio documentary producer. He was the inaugural writer in residence for the American Civil Liberties Union. He's been on, you've seen him on Dateline, ABC News, Good Morning America. And most importantly, for the purposes of our interview today, he is actually a really prolific writer and author of a dozen books on issues of, politics, more or less. One of the books that was best-selling was The Rage of a Privileged Class, which was a novel. He also wrote a book about the American Civil Liberties Union called Democracy, If We Can Keep It. And today we're going to be interviewing him about his book that just came out this week called The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America. And we're really excited about this because the topic of today's episode is going to be the same topic as his book, as you might imagine, which is about the limits of free speech, if there should be any, what is the value, is free speech the same thing as freedom, is
Right.
Deregulation the same thing as freedom, right? This is something that we talk about on the left all the time is, are you really free if you let corporations run everything without any kind of regulation,
Right.
And are you really free where they pretend that you have equality, but you don't have any money to compete with the corporations who actually get to dominate conversations, economic life, political life. And
Right.
This is actually a huge topic in this book. And surprisingly, even though the book is titled about free speech, it goes to the core of a democracy. And I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add to
Yeah,
that,
I was
Decatur.
just gonna say, I think what I want people to keep in mind when they listen to this, I think living in America, it seems the one thing that's been overvalued more than anything in its entire, our entire existence, at least from us growing up, is free speech. And we hear that constantly, like that's why we're better than other nations, is because we can say whatever. Well, now I think we're seeing the political ramifications of being at a crossroads with that. So I do think it's something to keep in mind about how our values are changing. And because of that, what can we do to fix our free speech problem? And we're going to get into a lot of that today in this episode, but
Yeah, and we're really excited for this interview. We're going to bring him on here in just a moment. But, we just wanted to let you know how excited we are to have him on. He's been on the scene for a long time, way before us, talking about politics. And it's just going to be great to pick his brain about these things, hold his feet to the fire a little bit about some of his ideas. But honestly, I think he's coming from a really good place, and he just wants to see, one of the things he talks about is like what free speech, just for the sake of free speech, maybe there's value to that, but isn't there also a question, like, isn't free speech also supposed to be in service of something greater, right? Don't we believe in free speech for a reason? Isn't that reason because we believe
Right.
that through free speech, we will come to the right answers, right? And he actually pushes back on some of those ideas. And we say, as long as we're talking about free speech in the sense of a completely deregulated, political environment, that the person with the most money gets to say what they want and no one else does, then maybe we're not actually getting to the right answers, and maybe there is a way to regulate the political
Right.
environment.
Well, I think too, a good thing that he points out that I'm sure we'll get into too is, free speech is great when we assume that the truth wins, and we are now living in a post-truth era. So what does free speech mean because of that?
Absolutely. And one other thing, hopefully we get a chance that the interview is a half an hour, so hopefully we get a chance to talk to him about this. But just like, you've probably heard buzzing around on the internet a little bit that the Freedom Index, I think it was, no longer rates us a full-on democracy, and they now say we're a flawed democracy. And I thought, yeah, hooray. Of course, I'm talking about the United States for those listening outside of our country. I think that's, now that I've read this book, he talks so much about like the ways that the public's opinion doesn't actually really matter at all, or that actually a very small minority of the country controls the rest. And it's not just about money. There's structural reasons why that are really fascinating, that actually really predate this whole like disastrous Citizens United decision that made corporations people and allowed them to spend whatever they want on elections. There's actually been structural problems with the way we have even called ourselves a democracy from the very beginning that actually kind of makes it laughable that we call ourselves a democracy. The idea that like a very small portion of our country actually runs everything is really upsetting. So I'm excited.
It's a sad myth.
It's a sad myth. I think that, it's one of those ideas where like they tell us it's a democracy, although the Republicans will be the first to be like, it's not a democracy, it's a democratic republic, which at least one constitutional scholar says those are synonyms. Like that's a silly thing to say. But it's telling that they say that, because it actually shows that the people on the right really aren't interested in democracy, and neither were the founders. And that's a big portion of this book, where they talk about the way the founders designed the way we pick a president, the way votes have to be balanced out by a Senate that does not represent the majority. It's a really fascinating topic, and the way they from the start never designed us to be a democracy, not a true one. And so I'm really excited to talk to him about that, because I don't think it would be a mystery to anyone in this call that Decatur and I both are down with real democracy and not this sham that we have been living through for a long time.
Definitely. Despite what I get on these, political compass-esque tests.
Yeah, we took a few tests. I came back Democratic Socialist, as no one would be surprised. But
I came back Kim Jong-un, apparently.
Yeah. He's kidding. But anyhow. All right. So we're going to bring him on in just a minute here. We're going to take a quick break. But stay tight, and this will be a good interview. Hello, hey. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. Good. Thanks so much for coming on our show.
Oh, my pleasure.
How's it going? We both really, really enjoyed your book. It was really awesome. Yeah, no, it's super, super timely. This is a really important conversation that people need to be having right now.
It was eye-opening in some positive ways and eye-opening in some better go buy some land somewhere else ways.
Hopefully not too depressing, but yeah.
No, definitely not.
Very strange times.
It's definitely a page turner. You can tell that you've been a writer for a very long time. Very easy to read, really informative. But we were telling our audience before you came on a little bit about some of the really interesting topics you brought up about how, the dichotomy between, well, it doesn't have to be a dichotomy, but the relationship between kind of social interests and free speech, and how those aren't actually always going together. And also, that's fascinating to me. And then another thing that really, really got my wheels turning is this idea. I can say that I probably was one of those more like ACLU type of like free speech extremists that you mentioned, like the people who represented in the Charlottesville rally. Like I might have agreed with their decision to do that before I read your book, and now I'm not so sure. So that's probably a great place to start. You talked about the Charlottesville rally, and of course for our audience that you should know this already, but if you don't, that was the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists held a rally there, and the ACLU defended their decision to do that. And then it turned out violent and 3 people died. And so that tees up the question perfectly is this kind of free speech extremism actually what we want? Is this good?
I think, Steve, you actually have to sort of separate the question into a few different questions, because the ACLU, the Virginia chapter, which defended the Nazis or the defend, what was it called? Unite the Right.
Unite the Right rally. Right.
In that case, actually got involved because the ACLU has a long history of defending Nazis, KKK people, other extremists from the right and from the left, but certainly from the right. And that goes back to the beginning. I mean, one of the earlier documents that was produced by the ACLU was a pamphlet basically asking, why do we defend Nazis as we sort of move towards World War II? And the question they gave then is the question that they've consistently given. And it came up again in 1978, when there was the march in Skokie, which was neo-Nazis. And Skokie is a suburb of Chicago, which happened to, at the time, have a lot of Holocaust survivors living there. And so people were up in arms as to how in the world can you defend these Nazis? And the answer they gave then, which they to some extent will still give, is that, we're defending against an ordinance that Skokie passed, which would make it impossible for Nazis to march. But the way that they structured this ordinance is the same way that people in Selma, Alabama want to put together ordinances that will make it impossible for civil rights people to march. And we can't defend their right to speech in Selma without defending the right of Nazis to speak here. That was the sort of rationale. And they sailed along easily and happily with that rationale until Charlottesville a couple of years ago. And what happened then was that there was this question came up. And because it had been sort of a routine question for the ACLU, they said, well, of course, we'll defend these people. And then, as you say, things went to hell. I mean, the march never happened. Actually, the Skokie march never happened either, but that's for a whole nother set of reasons. But there was so much violence, that the march didn't happen. But proceeding to that, they got a court decision, because originally what the city of Charlottesville wanted to do was to move that march. They said, okay, we respect your right to march, but we don't think you ought to have it in the center of town in this particular park. You ought to have it someplace where police can be more in control of things, where it's less likely to cause something disruptive. And the ACLU position was sort of a knee-jerk reaction. Well, no, you're making this decision because of the content of the speech, so we still have to defend these people. And they defended them. They got a ruling that said that they were perfectly justified in keeping their original plans to have the march basically at this park. That was normally, that had been Robert E. Lee Park. They were renaming it to Emancipation Park. There was the question of a statue. All of that was why they wanted to have it in that park. And they said, okay, we're not gonna, we're gonna have this thing in the park. And the city said, fine, you can have the thing in the park. Day of the march comes up. They show up as Virginia's an open carry state. A lot of people are armed. A lot of people are, looking for trouble. And so things get violent even before the march is supposed to start. So the police basically called the march for safety reasons. As you mentioned, two things happened, in Sioux. One is that two policemen who were in a helicopter or sort of monitoring the situation, their plane crashes, those two die. And then a guy who was a Nazi sympathizer who apparently held Adolf Hitler as a personal hero takes a car and plunges it into a crowd, and one woman is killed, and many other people are injured. And so there is this soul searching that goes on within the ACLU. And there are differences now in the ACLU now and the ACLU back in 1978. Back in 1978, it did not have a racial justice unit. It did not have any significant number of Black employees or other minority employees. They did not have a president who seemed to be encouraging, and at least to some people seemed to be encouraging hate speech. So it's a very different situation. So even internally, it was rocked. And there are some people internally arguing, we shouldn't be defending people like this. There are other people on the outside saying, wait a minute, this is what we've always done. Of course, we have to defend people like this. There were lots of discussions held back and forth. The part of the staff wrote a letter saying we feel betrayed by what the ACLU did, and we feel even more betrayed by the way they responded to the questions, pretending as if there's no issue here. There is an issue here. And they ultimately decided that, okay, we're going to have a different kind of way of choosing who we defend, but we're not going to back away from the issue. We're going to basically give people more vetting, and we're not going to defend people who are carrying guns. Yeah. So it was a very difficult issue for them, and I went into that into some detail just to sort of walk you through some of the thinking that went back and forth. It was actually a black attorney, a female attorney, who was the legal director up in Virginia at that time, and part of the decision to defend this hate group was made by her, and for her the issue was very personal and very painful. And she said that, because of this philosophy, that basically they're defending the right to speech, not the speech, not the content of the speech. They needed to defend it. And so now, as I said, these cases are supposed to get a little bit more vetting. They haven't actually changed their policy other than to not allow people with weapons, if they are going to defend you. So all that to say that part of, I think, what has happened in the years since then is there was a much more visible racial justice movement that's sort of emerged and become part of a lot of these progressive movements. And part of that set of discussions they had was, like, we have two sets of values here. We have a set of values where we value inclusion, where we value people who are of color or different religions, but we also value very much free speech. And I think that's sort of where the question is left. I mean, if you're asking me where I come down on that issue, I come down on the issue of saying you have to make these decisions on a case-by-case basis. I think there are circumstances under which they may still defend Nazis, depending upon what I don't think this particular case was a good case. I don't think that they necessarily should have gone to the wall to defend these people's right to have a march in this particular park as opposed to another park. They were going to be allowed to march. I don't think it was as important of an issue as some people at the ACLU thought it was. But I can certainly conceive of a situation where if you have something more similar to what happened in Skokie, and the city is passing ordinances that can affect any number of groups, that they would take a position that acknowledges that. Or I can also see a situation where if they are adopting a policy that can be broadly applied, and that is, if another kind of set of city fathers get in there and they say, okay, we're not going to let the pro-female group or the pro-feminist group march. We're not going to, because we have this law that was originally constructed, to deal with Nazis. So I don't think it's a simple issue, and I think that it's not going to become a simple issue. But I think what has become clear is that these other considerations have to be taken into account, and you can't just say that because that speech is speech and therefore it's protected, because the clear fact of the matter is there's never been a time in American history when all speech was protected. Speech has always had to certain things, and going back even before the Chaplinsky decision, about fighting words. I mean, there were a number of decisions which basically articulated this idea: if whatever this speech was going to lead to imminent violence, and then it's not permitted, that's still a fact, and so speech was never just speech, and we can say anything you want. I mean, the fighting words doctrine has pretty much fallen into use, but the idea, that you have, whether it's child pornography or some other thing that we just decide is so awful that it shouldn't be dealt with or shouldn't be permitted, is in play. But I think the larger issue, in a sense, is when you get to that kind of speech, is not so much what the government is doing and laws about whether speech should be allowed of a certain sort in a situation analogous to Charlottesville. It's a lot of it is what's happening on the internet, what's happening in these sort of venues, and to what extent they should be inhibited in making certain types of speech. And that's not so much a government issue as it is a societal issue, and the issue of to what extent we expect these institutions to have policies and rules which allow for civil discourse as opposed to encourage people to go to Christchurch and start shooting people, or whatever it is that they encourage people to do.
Well, I
or
think
South
that's
Carolina,
I think that's kind of interesting too, because I know you point something out, which I think was really helpful in the book, of how, is like how free speech is being looked at and how kind of American values are changing, where, we're not, as, I guess, terrible in a lot of ways. We care more about dignity and all these things that's changing. I definitely think we're seeing that with, our generation and the generation below Steve and I too. And you kind of talk about the issue of free speech on college campuses. And I was curious kind of what your thoughts are of how much of that's blown out of proportion.
I think as I made pretty clear, I think a lot of it's blown out of proportion. And I think a lot of it's self-correcting. I mean, it was very interesting to watch the Republican convention this year. I lost count of how many speakers there were, but at least 8 speakers devoted a large part of their time, to how they're the party of free speech now. I found rather interesting. I mean, given that this very publicized event where our president violently shut down a speech at Lafayette Park.
Right.
In order for, or I should say, a speech event in order to walk through there with a Bible so he could exercise his free speech right, to get a picture of a Bible in front of a church.
Upside down, mind you.
Upside down, and also, the same president who routinely conflates any kind of protest that is from the left with violence, and automatically these are things that ought to be put down. The cops and maybe the feds ought to come in and arrest these people and knock them in the heads. So it's hard to, it's hard to sort of square that with this big argument that they're really for free speech. And then going back even to the stance on free speech in college campuses. I mean, the president a couple of years ago issued an executive order basically saying that if colleges didn't respect free speech, they're going to be denied federal funding, and then essentially ordering them to do what most colleges are already doing. And what was interesting about that is that the trigger for that was a Milo Yiannopoulos event at the University of California, Berkeley, which became this event that cost the university millions of dollars because of security. It became violent because people from outside the community came in and decided to disrupt it. There were explosions that went on and fires that broke out on campus as a result of this. And then Milo Yiannopoulos, who had been given the largest venue on campus to speak, is screaming about how his free speech rights are being denied. It was clearly a stunt. And Ann Coulter has engaged in much the same thing. I mean, she sets up a situation where she sort of baits people into challenging her right to speak, and then uses this to generate even more publicity. And no one seriously thinks that Ann Coulter's right to speak is being infringed upon.
Right.
So it becomes this sort of fantastical issue that they make, because I have yet to hear the far right saying that, well, okay, so why don't they let these progressive and pro-abortion speakers speak on these colleges that don't like that, and these, they don't do that.
Right.
It's for a very specific set of ideas that they want speech protection. And so that's, I think, just a little bit silly, but sure. I think there are, instances where on college campuses where they shut down things that I don't think they should have shut down, and where they have violated people's ability to communicate the message, which I don't think it's all necessarily all that helpful either. But it's
also like 20-year-olds also a lot of times identifying themselves for the first time and figuring out the world. So
right, exactly. And a lot of colleges, as you know, I mean, the University of Chicago a few years ago articulated a very strong statement against this sort of stuff. Some colleges signed on to it, some didn't. But I think that, if we're looking at where the dangerous situation is in terms of speech in America, it's not college campuses. But yes, I mean, there are instances that we can point to, and there are events we can point to where people on the left have gone, further than they should have been, and they should have, and acting things have happened that shouldn't have happened. Yes, that's absolutely true.
When you, we actually did an episode not too long ago covering these guys who call themselves the intellectual dark web, and they're just kind of, most of them are right wingers on the internet who are complaining that their free speech rights are being trampled on because they don't want to be politically correct and people are trying to make them be. And of course they have millions of subscribers, and it's silly to complain about that because they're doing fine. But what I think is what was so great about how you kind of teed up this whole conversation in your book is the ability to just open your mouth and speak doesn't really mean a lot unless people hear you. And to have people hear you kind of requires that you have some power and money to get that to happen. And so this conflation of like deregulation versus actual freedom, I don't think, after reading your book, I feel kind of confident to say, like, it's not the same thing just to say if we does the government shouldn't touch speech at all, or Facebook shouldn't have any policies on speech. Well, that's not a neutral decision. That actually means that your position is that the most powerful people should be the ones who get to speak the most. And that's kind of
especially when that's backed by the Supreme Court decision. I mean, Citizens
exactly.
United, FEC, which overturned the Feingold finance reform law, and basically allows all of this money to flow into political speech and in direct support of candidates. And I think one of the more eloquent objections to that was raised by Stevens in his dissent. I mean, this whole idea he pointed out of looking at corporations as people is ridiculous in the way that it was articulated. Institutions that are corporations don't vote, they don't die. It's not even clear often who they're speaking for. And so whatever rights they have, and they have considerable sets of rights, they're not exactly equivalent to the rights that you and I have as citizens and as individuals. And yet that's now the law of the land. And we certainly know that the ability to advertise heavily, to get a message out there, has a huge impact on the political process. And so you're giving one set of players much more power than you're giving the others when you allow that to happen. And I think that that's part of what's happened with speech in our society. It's that people who are effectively without finances, without power, don't have much speech. Because no one listens to them, and I guess a more abstract point, is that the scholarship around speech and the way we evolved into our current view of speech has a lot to do with events that took place in court decisions that were made after World War II. And so this whole idea, articulated probably most eloquently by Brandeis, of the purpose behind free speech, this idea that bad ideas give way to good ideas, that the shining light of truth will ultimately outshine, lies, that the way to a more perfect union, the way to a more perfect society is through the vigorous exercise of free speech. That sounds maybe a little bit naive now, but that was the intellectual framework under which our way of thinking about free speech evolved. And so I don't think you can separate that from our current reality, where we're discovering again that, well, this thing about the blinding light of truth doesn't necessarily seem to be working all that well.
It's just not. It's not. Yeah, no, that's very easily concluded, especially when what's being drowned. The truth is being drowned out by money, and money is always backed by an agenda, right? And
it's being drowned out by money. It's also being drowned out by just naked power. I mean, we've never had the situation that we have now in our country. We had McCarthyism, of course,
right?
But McCarthy was a junior senator with a fairly limited set of powers. I mean, he didn't control the Justice Department. He didn't control the executive branch of government. he couldn't really order anybody to do anything except for maybe you to appear before his subcommittee to be questioned. He could subpoena you, and he could denounce you publicly, but he didn't have real power.
Right.
We have a president with real power, who would be fine if he spoke the truth, but whose agenda is a mishmash of things, a huge part of which is untruthful and propaganda. And I think the Washington Post has some now over 20,000 falsehoods that,
Oh yeah.
and counting. And so it's different than you or I speaking, and it's not just money. It's that he's the head of the government, so his words mean something, and they have to be listened to, and they have to, and it creates a dilemma, not just for ordinary citizens who are trying to figure out what to do, and say in the age of COVID, it creates a dilemma for the media. I've spent my entire career in one way or another attached to the press. And I came up with a set of values, which is that we try to be objective, or at least as objective as is humanly possible, that we try to give both sides of every issue. And I think we saw the beginnings of how that can really make mischief during the coverage of the Clinton Trump race originally. You had a certain equivalency that was drawn between Clinton's tendency to shade the truth a bit at times, and Trump's tendency to outright make up stuff. And it became, they're both dishonest. It's they're kind of the same, right?
Yeah.
And not quite. It's a different level. And I think also, if you go back to the 2004 race, where we had John Kerry running against George Bush. We had the political operators realize a huge truth for them, which was that you could take something that was factually true and make it just the opposite of what it was. You had a guy who had won, the Bronze Star, who was a war hero. And you make him into something approximating a war criminal and a coward and a liar and all these other things, and you make a film about that, and you make an advertisement about that, and you write a book about that, and it's totally made up nonsense, but it has a huge impact, and the truth doesn't cut into that, because he's not as skilled as the propaganda makers are at getting their message across. And so what I think the insight that the current president took from that is that, and also from his own actions, is that you can make lies work for you very well, even if the truth is accessible, because you can drown out the truth. And his test run for that was what got him into politics, I think, originally, which was the birtherism lie about Obama not being a citizen and somehow having tricked his way into office, even though he was from Kenya. And Trump send investigators out to Hawaii, and we're going to get the truth of whether there's a birth certificate. I'm going to send. Well, he never sent investigators anywhere. He was not interested in the truth. It was all one big lie, and he has realized you can run a presidency on that. Even when you have videotape of you saying something else, you accuse it of being fake news. You're accusing the media of spinning things. You accuse it of being somehow manufactured, even when it clearly is not. That's a powerful insight, but it's also a powerful refutation of the ability of truth to triumph necessarily. It doesn't, and it raises a question about how we have a political process, that is more transparent. And that is more focused on things that are real as opposed to spin.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about the way, I do believe I remember reading this a bit in your book, about the way that on social media and on the internet, like it's not about, I think it's the same way in the media as well. In general, it's not about, whether or not it's true or an interesting piece of information. What really takes the platform is just the most outrageous things that people say.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because they have algorithms which look at things that are getting lots of views, and of course the things that get lots of views are things that people have a intense emotional response to, and things that people have intense emotional response to are not necessarily the most rational things in the world. On one side, they're cute puppies and stuff like that. Okay, but
Right,
on the
right,
other side, is people talking about pedophile rings that are being run by major politicians and hate
right.
speech, and stuff like that. And I think we as a society are trying to grapple with that. I mean, as I said, I come out of print for the most part, even though I've done other media, and I remember very distinctly, I was at Newsweek at the time, when all of a sudden and things went online, and all of a sudden, uh, you get this phenomenon where people are rating your stories, and you're going, "What in the hell is this?" But yeah, and all of a sudden, there's this new metric. It's not whether the story is accurate. It's not whether it's important. It's how popular this story is. Being viewed by various people, and that changes things, and it changes the way some journalists think about things. But it definitely changes what happens, online when the whole game is about getting views. And the whole game is about things that, or at least a lot of the game, is about things that grab eyeballs. So you have a lot of extremist stuff because that's a way to make money. But you also have a lot of extremist stuff because that's what a particular group of people are attracted to.
Right.
And they on the internet find communities where that's fostered. And so you have one example after another. You can't necessarily blame the internet for someone, say like Dylan Roof, who goes to South Carolina and shoots up a church, but he certainly found a very supportive community on the internet, which encouraged him, to do something like that, and help to enable him to do something like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the terrifying part, that we're all a bit afraid of QAnon as we see them running races. And we can talk about money all day, but I mean, that's naked power right there. As Trump gives them the A-OK, and then they're winning, congressional districts, primaries at least. So
right. I mean, and we saw this coming. I mean, the fellow who showed up in Washington D.C. With a gun, to stop Hillary Clinton from kidnapping children for this so-called ring. I mean, that's there are a lot of people who are very susceptible to this stuff, and other people who, for a variety of reasons, a psychologist would understand better than I do, want to believe this stuff. And the way the internet is run really appeals to them. But let me go back to something that I think we mentioned earlier, which is the Zuckerberg approach, to political lying.
Right.
I think it's problematical because I'm not for government censorship of the internet. I think that it's problematic on any number of levels.
Sure.
But I think there ought to be some rules of decency about what goes out there, and the idea that extremely blatant lies are not guarded against somehow,
Right.
But just permitted, strikes me as absurd. And I mean, I write about this in the book a bit because it just really, I thought, was infuriating. I mean, the idea, that you're going to defend a presidential candidate or another candidate, totally making up things about somebody else, because this is in the great tradition of freedom of the press and freedom of speech, as articulated by Sullivan v. New York Times. Wait a minute.
Right.
Yeah, Sullivan v. New York Times was not the same as the Zuckerberg taking. I mean, in his great speech where he defended this, he talked about, well, our tradition goes back to this because in Sullivan you had this case where there was misinformation that was handed out, and so now we have this case of misinformation. So it's all the same. essentially was his point. If you understand history at all, you know there are half a dozen reasons why it's not at all the same. But the Sullivan case revolved around a situation in Alabama where the movement that was led by Martin Luther King was under furious attack by elected officials and appointed officials, including the police chief, the governor, and everyone on down. The group of ministers who were supportive of Martin Luther King took out an advertisement in the New York Times trying to garner support for their movement, in which they did their attempt to document what had happened to them. The being blocked from entering certain places, the bombings that had taken place, the arrests that had taken place, the harassment that had taken place, et cetera. And in documenting that, they had some errors. They had the wrong number for the number of times he had been arrested, for instance. It wasn't 8 times, it was 7 times. Small things.
Yeah, right.
Right.
What we call immaterial mistakes. Like, it
exactly.
doesn't matter. Come on. Yeah.
But that was what the officials from Alabama jumped on. And they're saying, this is Bible. And they got these in the Alabama state courts, of course. And then it ends up before the Supreme Court. And Supreme Court, obviously and wisely says, wait a minute, this is nonsense. And right. Also had these poor ministers, whose property had been attached for these huge settlements. And so the Supreme Court basically says, no, you need to have actual malice. You need to actually have lies that you meant to be lies, and there's another standard here, particularly for public figures going on. And so for Zuckerberg to try to compare the civil rights workers of the South to Donald Trump and his political advertising I just find offensive on so many levels. And it's not misinformation that they were spreading, and those were innocent errors. It's not innocent errors. When Trump denounces people for things that he knows they didn't do, that's not an innocent error.
Right. He's making material, and the way I think about it a little bit, just as an analogy for people who, really think like, I just don't think that any powerful institution should be regulating speech at all. Well, of course you don't believe that, or you would think that it would be okay for me to post an ad on Facebook that, I'm false advertising some product and I defraud people, or it's okay to pretend to be some prince from Africa and wire me a bunch of money. Like, these are all speech, but it's also a lie. And I'm using that lie to try to get you to make a really horrible mistake for your life. And I think anyone who believes in democracy thinks that how we exercise our vote is also a really important decision. And so the idea that you can just go on social media and lie and no one should do anything about that, and how can we even conceive of a world where we would regulate that kind of speech, to me just it's naive. Of course we should regulate that. It's lies. And right. Now, like you mentioned, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, but what it also reflects, Steve, it's a huge misunderstanding about what speech is protected and what speech is not protected.
Right.
I mean, I think that, there is this idea out there that free speech means you can pretty much say anything, and you're right. protected in saying that and in the environment. The free speech guarantee was very specific in the sense that it barred Congress, and by implication the federal government, from limiting your speech in certain ways, and that came for a very simple reason. I mean, what became the United States was getting out from under the English, and a king, who could do all kinds of things to people. They didn't want to repeat that mistake, and so they had this Bill of Rights, and they built that in. But as I'm sure you know, but a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, don't. Originally, the Bill of Rights didn't even apply to the states. That took another process for that to happen. That didn't happen until 1925. Yep. So the idea that people sort of have that, well, the founders meant people to be able to just say anything whenever they wanted to, even if it's hateful, even if it's harmful. Wait a minute, that's not ever how free speech has been determined in our country. And even if you take the point that I argue is true, which is that we weren't very serious about the First Amendment until the 20th century. Even if you accept that as true, which I think is, once we began to accept the First Amendment, we still had restrictions on it. I mean, into the 40s, we had people still being sent to prison and being convicted for being communists, for God's sake.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So,
well, and then sorry, just to say, I mean, that we see that kind of rhetoric from Trump and the supporters now. I mean, Joe Biden is considered a Marxist to Donald Trump, which is, outlandish. And it does seem like, if we're not careful, it's kind of a new era of McCarthyism.
Well, it's a language of polarization, and Trump is among many people who have become sort of expert in that. Trump knows very well that Biden is not a Marxist. I don't even know what Marxism means.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
But he knows that it's something that people aren't supposed to like. And he knows that, that you are some kind of radical. And so he's trying to portray himself in a certain way. And so he's tossing words around. And obviously, that word has a history, and the whole Palmer raids part of our history, where we locked up people because of they belong to certain parties and they believe certain things, or going back to World War I, where we locked up people because they had the nerve to speak out against the war. Or in one bizarre case that I write about, which I find fascinating, they locked up a guy because he made what he thought was a patriotic movie about the American Revolution and called it The Spirit of '76, and thought he was doing something that was supportive of the war effort. But in doing that, he criticized the English, who were now our ally. You can criticize them. So boom, he gets a 10-year sentence, which happily for him was commuted, but his career never went anywhere.
Exactly.
And so this naive notion that they are articulating, is just not historically accurate. That their rights are being trampled in a way that were never happened before. People's rights have always been subject to other considerations, and including the right of speech. And when you add that to the fact that we're still in the process of working through what we really believe about the Bill of Rights and about free speech, and that working through that in an environment in which many Americans are extremely ignorant about what any of that means, although they know that they support it. And so you have this sort of interesting dichotomy where you have roughly 90% or 91%, depending on the poll, of Americans who support the free speech, support a free press. But you also have 39% saying that the president ought to have the power to shut down the New York Times and to shut down CNN and to shut down other broadcasters who are doing things that are not right. And clearly you can't believe both things at the same time and be a logical person.
Absolutely. Decatur, Brent, did you have any last questions? Because we've gone way over the time that we planned on, and I don't want to take any more of your time. So.
Yeah, we don't want to take up too much. I just do have a question, kind of, if you have any thoughts on how to get through to kind of this anti-PC culture mob of people who are just voting basically off the fact that Donald Trump is a free speech candidate in their eyes, and Joe Biden is the censors, or everyone on the left is a censorship fiend or something like that. If you have any advice on how we can talk to these people in the anti-PC world.
Well, I think you talk to them with courtesy and respect, and maybe 5% of them will listen to you.
Right. right.
But
yeah, that's true.
But I think the reality is we are just highly polarized, and when we have so many buttons that get touched, and the minute you say something to someone that's critical of someone that they admire and adore, they're going to shut you out. They're going to shut you down, and I think that's just a tragedy of our society right now. And when we're polarized both politically and racially the way that we are, it makes it very difficult to have meaningful discussions about some of the most important issues that we are facing. because you're met not with a reasonable discussion, or not even with a reasonable argument. When you point out the flaws in this way of thinking, you're met instead with accusations and slogans and maybe curse
Right.
words. You know,
Right.
War
right.
on Christmas.
And so that excuse me. So there's not a discussion that gets you there.
Yeah. Well, everybody, we both really enjoyed the book. I have it here. There's also an audiobook version that I actually got that too, because I like audiobooks. So it's a really good narrator. His name's Corey Jackson, has a great voice. So, either way, we encourage everybody to check it out. And we're just so grateful you took the time to talk to us today. This is such an important topic. Just goes really to the core of our democracy, and it kind of puts everything else. It's almost like whatever issue you care about, good luck getting that passed, or making that the law, or making that the reality in our society if we don't handle first, our democracy. What about, how does free speech work? How do we actually make there's a lot that we didn't even get a chance to get into about, how our government, the Senate only represents 18% of the population, all these problems that we have. We're going to talk about it more after we let you go. But, again, this is such an important topic, no matter what issues you're most passionate about, whether it be the environment, or, progressive values, or anything like that. So again, just thank you so much for taking the time to come on our show. And we really are grateful you wrote this book and came on.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it. So thanks for taking the time.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, have a great afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you. You take good care.
Mm-hmm. All right. Bye. Okay.
Wow.
All
So
right.
I think the important thing to take away from everything we just learned is we are great interviewers.
Decatur's down on himself for not talking more. And I agree with him. He's the worst. But I think that this was a really good conversation. There's obviously, only a 45-minute interview. There's only so much you can talk about. But what was really interesting, what really was interesting to me about this book was two things. One is this idea that, you hear a lot of people talking about on the left. It's like, when the right talks about freedom, they're not actually talking about freedom for the individual. They're talking about creating a world that's so deregulated that someone else fills the power vacuum, right? So in the context of economics, we don't want to create a cooperative economy at all. We just want to have this economy that the government just completely supports corporations and does nothing to, tax anybody, lower taxes, blah, blah, blah. They just want to get rid of regulation, everything, so the corporations can just run the show. And what was so interesting to me, and I had never really thought about this that much before, was that the same exact issue applies to freedom of speech. Is that the idea that we should live in a world where we just like Mark Zuckerberg, throw our hands up and say, I don't know what to do about, all these lies on the internet. I think that,
which just to point out too, the irony in the Mark Zuckerberg story, which we didn't get into in the interview, but everything going on there right now, where we're seeing the top 10 list of, the most shared and promoted people and articles and websites on the site is all right-wing people, including Ben Shapiro. The Daily Wire is even a fact-checking website for them, which is just absolutely ridiculous that they're even allowed to do that. And then we see Peter Thiel, who is the CEO of Thiel Capital, is on the board at Facebook, who was taking calls with white nationalists, and white nationalists openly saying, oh, he's our George Soros. So this idea that Mark Zuckerberg is just, I'm out of it, I'm not trying to do anything. Clearly you're leaning one way on this.
Well, and here's the thing, lest you be confused and think that Mark Zuckerberg is truly taking the libertarian approach. No, Mark Zuckerberg knows his audience. His audience is very conservative, very Republican. Twitter is not the same audience. Even Instagram is not the same. Facebook in particular is a very conservative platform with the type of people who are on Facebook, and he knows that. So he's not some benevolent libertarian.
And conspiracy theories run more rampant on Facebook than the other major mainstream social media sites. I saw a stat that QAnon posts on Twitter have raised since March 73%. Well, it's over 400% on Facebook. So clearly that shows you
Yep.
The dichotomy
Yeah.
of it is.
Yeah,
is
just
thrown off.
because, in case anyone listening doesn't know much about QAnon, I know we have kind of a broader base of audience.
You don't have to keep. We say this every episode in case the
Do
audience.
people know what QAnon is by
if
now?
If you haven't looked it up, then why are you even listening to us? Because we talk about it every goddamn episode.
He's being an ass. We just real quick, QAnon is a far-right conspiracy theory that thinks that Hillary Clinton and company are the deep state, and they're part of a global cabal that's trying to they're pedophiles, and they're part of a sex trafficking operation with kids, and they want to drink kids' blood. It's a thing like that. Decatur,
just like
one of
things
those.
you joke around about with your friends.
It's one of those, one of those funny things that's going to ruin our democracy. But going back to the book, though, that's actually a great segue. There was a lot of stuff we didn't have a time to talk to Mr. Cose about, but he does talk. What was really shocking to me and really upsetting is learning more about how certain parts of our government works that I didn't really fully understand. And so one of the stats that he threw out in his book is that the Senate, right? So you have the House of Representatives and you have the Senate. You need in our government, for any law to pass, you need 3 groups to agree. You need the House, you need the Senate, and you need the president to sign it. Now, the president being able to veto anything is a debatable concept, but focusing on the Senate. So let's say you have the House of Representatives that wants to pass some progressive bill, and then it gets to the Senate. Now, what happens is, because the Senate is only giving 2 senators per state, then that's irrespective of population. And the way that works out is that the least populated states now have an equal voice to the most populated states. So literally, like Wyoming has equal votes in the Senate that California does, even though their populations are polar opposite. And what the practical effect of that is that the least populated 26 states only hold 18% of the national population, and yet they get to control everything, right? There's only 50 states to 26. So the point is that a majority of the Senate represents only 18% of the entire population of the country. So there's a lot of different ways to explain this statistic, but basically how it breaks down is your vote is almost 6 times more important if you live in Wyoming than in California, as it pertains to your respective power in the Senate. So,
or I think that's a good thing to point out. And I think even like a better example to look at is somewhere, look at a different state as Alabama or Arkansas, North Carolina, South Carolina, all these states where, they have more power than I guess the states that should. But the scary part is these are also states that are oppressing, Black people's right to vote,
right.
And,
Exactly.
and things like that. So now what you have is not only is this smaller state controlling everything, but because it's smaller and they've been able to have the same party essentially for decades there, they've been able to control more and not even get the democracy there. And I don't want to live in a country where Alabama, Wyoming, North Dakota, nothing wrong with the listeners there who are actually listening to us. I don't want those states especially to have the control over what democracy is.
Well, right. I mean, that's how the argument is always going back and forth. And I admit, actually, before reading this book, I was kind of a little agnostic on the question of the Senate, because I thought I can see the argument that if we didn't have a Senate, then the people in rural states really wouldn't have all that meaningful of a voice, because groups, places like LA and New York, they're just so populated, they basically run the show. And then the needs and interests of rural people wouldn't actually be represented in the government. That was what I believed not even a week ago. At least I was agnostic to it. I was like, I can see this. I'm conflicted on it. But flip that on its head. This is what the book does. Flip that on its head. The issue here is that now what we decided to do instead is let just the rural people run everything. And right. Now, like LA and New York, their votes are literally, your relative power in the government is 6 times less than someone in a rural state. And the problem that Decatur just mentioned is that in the rural states, they're not really progressive, and they really don't care about your rights unless you look and sound like them a lot of the time.
Right.
And so I don't know why I said sound, but whatever. Look, and
and you sound like this.
if you're a squeaker, as the gamers would say, you don't have rights. So
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Could you? I don't know what a squeaker is. What's that?
Oh, a squeaker is when you're in a video game. I play games. I'm not any good. Don't ask me to stream unless you want a good laugh. But anyway, a squeaker is a guy who jumps on, or a kid. It's a kid. So they just say, "Hey, everybody," and then everyone's like, muted. Like instantly. It's a running gag with the gamer community. Is like, don't jump on the mic until you're old enough to not sound like that. But anyway, whatever.
Right.
It's kind of they're bad people, dude. Gamers are. It's not a good crowd. There's a lot of racism. Anyhow, this is a really interesting point. I didn't really get into it that much during the interview. So to make the issue about hate speech more complicated, and what he was talking about in there is like free speech has never been absolute. Even the founding fathers didn't think it should be absolute. And then when you look at situations like Nazis trying to do a rally, I mean, I think it's really easy for like progressives and leftists to be like, fuck them. Like, they don't get a rally. Like, I don't want them to have a rally. That's harmful speech. That's speech that is about harming other people. It's just a really easy answer to be like, I don't agree with Nazis, But here's where it gets more complicated, because another example he gives in this book is if your ultimate goal is, I actually don't care that much about free speech. What I really care about is racial equality. Let's just make that your goal. Well, there's a really terrible history of the South, the majority in the South using government to imprison and censor abolitionists during the 1800s. And that, of course, same law. We had the First Amendment back then, although, as Mr. Cose pointed out, it didn't apply to the states at the time. But that's the risk. That's the trade-off, right, that we're talking about, is like these abolitionists were out there, and they said the same thing about the abolitionists in the South that we're saying about the Nazis, although we're right and they were wrong. What they were saying is that we can't let the abolitionists be out here agitating, because that is going to lead to property destruction and harm, and it's going to lead to violence, and it's going to lead to insurrection, and this is all dangerous, and it's going to disrupt our communities just the same way, in a lot of ways, that we're talking about what the Nazi rallies are going to do.
Right. And I mean, I think though it's relevant to, exactly. Or if you want even a more modern example here, is look what the right is starting to say about Antifa. And if we start applying these same rules, then Antifa, by that same logic, is going to lose their freedom of speech. And say what you want about, Antifa. I don't think many people think it's the biggest problem who are listening to this podcast, but the right is terrified of Antifa, and they're going to use anything they can to silence that. Even with that conversation that leaked yesterday coming out, where someone leaked that in a conversation with William Barr, he had said to a bunch of judges, give the maximum sentences to these violent protesters, and charge them with overthrowing the U.S. government, which is obviously a very serious crime. And that's kind of, I think, a greater good that ACLU kind of extends their work to, whereas we have to represent some shitty people, but we're representing an idea, not necessarily a person.
I mean he gives, just so you know, like, I actually really liked this book and I marked it up. He also talks about,
I can't resell it.
Well, not this one. I have to keep it now. But the other examples he gives, not just the abolitionists, he talks about people who are speaking up against apartheid in South Africa. He gives the example of people protesting for Palestinians, and he specifically gives the example of people who were saying that there was a mural of a Palestinian person. It was all symbolic, and I won't bother to explain exactly what the mural was, but basically it was a pro-Palestine mural, and basically people who said it was hate speech, right? Like pro-Zionists were saying this Palestinian mural is hate speech, right? And so that's that's the trade-off. Now, look, that doesn't mean we just throw our hands up and say, okay, well then we have to tolerate all speech. The concern is like, how do we respond to it? Because hate speech, in my opinion, should be everyone's opinion, is a terrible thing. But is it the right solution to involve our government in deciding what is hate speech and what isn't? Because right now, I would not be very happy with Trump being the one to decide what constitutes hate speech and what doesn't, him and his Department of Justice, because quickly it will become, as it already is, Antifa and other leftists will be the ones who are right now, right? So now it's the perfect time to talk about this, because even though we hold progressive values with the civil and social issues, it doesn't mean that we necessarily want the government to be the ones to decide. It needs to be us.
And I think this is a super important issue for right now too, because, as he points to a lot of historical, examples of all this happening in America and all that. And definitely the Palestinian thing is still an issue because there's now anti-BDS laws popping up everywhere. But I think too, now of course. But now we're in a state of mass surveillance with the Patriot Act, and what does free speech mean under that? And that's a whole nother aspect, because now you can't protest in anonymity like you could before. So I think that's another level of all this, which talks about, I think, why it's important for, especially like you said, with the Trump administration, or whoever is there, you know what I mean? Someone's going to be silenced. People have these complaints about Obama, right? So,
I mean, I don't want Biden deciding what speech is good and what speech is bad.
Biden can't decide anything. I think we're good on that. But.
Yeah, right. He's not getting involved. But, the idea, well, what we did talk about with Mr. Cose, I think, is a really good distinction. There's hate speech, and then there's like the content of speech.
Right.
But then there's the accuracy and truthfulness of speech, right? And that is another issue that I immediately know people are going to jump on me and say, well, who gets to decide what's true? Well, now that's a really interesting question, but I can just...
Well, the answer is us.
It's definitely us. It's this podcast. So what we're going to propose is that we submit a law to Congress where the Super Politics podcast is the ultimate arbiters of truth. Yeah. And you can trust us because we're we're the best. Right. And so
I think that's a really important thing though. Yeah. And he breaks down really well, the McCarthyism era of all this too. And just this idea of calling everyone a communist, and thank God that Trump isn't as, well put together and disciplined as McCarthy was, because McCarthy didn't have that real power that Trump does have. Yeah. And I'm not saying we should feel safe for that, but because, things are getting worse.
It's just a matter of time. People will explain to him what he can do.
But I mean, he points out that there was these journalists back then who believed, truth will prevail. And that's the best reason for free speech. But now we're kind of living in this post-truth world, as you just said, Steve, and what is truth? So I think that it's a whole different set of, I guess.
Yeah.
Set of guidelines as to how.
Well, as it stands right now, as a society, we just don't even have like a general agreement like we used to on what is true and what isn't. I'll say that, like what you were just talking about, he jumps on it. It starts to pop off in the book on page 10, in my opinion. And this is where he breaks down like what is the kind of original. If you're like a free speech extremist, then usually you're operating on really three presumptions that none of them are really all that true. And one is that what you just said, which is that like and Mr. Cose said on the interview, is that the better argument will prevail. As long as they all at least have equal time to be heard, or relatively equal time to be heard, that somehow the best one will win out, because people are generally logical, which is not accurate at all. There's been tons of research about how our brains work, and we're illogical, not us, but everyone else. And so the other thing is the presumption that everyone is equally capable of being heard. Well, that's obviously not true. Let me tell you right now, if we tried to throw this episode up on Facebook, about 16 people will probably see it unless I pay Facebook money. And so that's just the reality we live in now. And then that skeptics are interested in listening to your point, even if you were equally capable of being heard. Joe Biden has no problem being heard, but who's listening to him? Well, I'm not. But and most people, and anyone skeptical of him isn't. And that's just how we work. He's not on my side. He's not on my team. Right. And I'm not, look, we've already talked about Biden enough on this show, but the point is he sucks. But what I'm trying to illustrate is like, there's an example of a guy who's equally capable of being heard. He's making some good arguments about some issues, and it's still no one on the right is even listening. So there's these really big presumptions we're making about how like completely deregulated speech is supposed to make us a better society. But we have to also recognize that speech is extremely powerful, right? If like, I love the movie V for Vendetta, and he talks about like, as long as we have our voice, then we'll never be completely, dominated or whatever in that really great speech he makes in the movie. And which, by the way, is a really great anarchist film if you're into far left philosophy. That was written by, the film itself is a little bit straight away from anarchism, but the actual original graphic novel that it's based on was actually written by an anarchist. And this was an anarchist. It's a really good, it's one of my favorite movies. But my favorite is The Matrix. Moving on. So, but these ideas.
Mine's Sleepless in Seattle. No, I'm playing.
It was Nick and Nora's Infinite Playlist. We talked about this. So anyway, basically my point is like we now see that like we have to balance this idea of free speech with what is actually going to create this society where people are truly free. Right? Because just saying that I don't want the government involved in my life, and that's what freedom is, or just saying that I don't want Facebook to filter any kind of message at all and to let whoever has the most money speak, that's freedom. I think most people would actually disagree with that as freedom once you talk about, do you feel as free as Microsoft to speak out about any issue? Or can Microsoft just pay an unlimited amount to be heard?
Well, I think
it's a random corporation, but
And that is actually like just kind of, this is a little different than what you're saying here, but I think that's such an important thing to point out and to ask people, like how is your freedom right now? Would you judge your freedom of speech? Because most people aren't complaining about any of these states or anything that's stopping free speech. What they're complaining about is people who are giving their opinion on their free speech, which there's that responsibility aspect of it. You know what I mean? And like really, and I think that's another thing that Ellis points out really carefully is that we shouldn't be concerned with what you and I are saying. Like that's going to happen regardless. But these corporations are the ones that are allowing only a certain flow of them and influx of them. And they're the ones that have the actual, last say in free speech, which is a terrifying thing, which goes back to the whole Facebook thing of Mark Zuckerberg being able to control who hears what. Algorithms are the ultimate privilege, right? Because, no one's searching the, specific disabled hashtag that someone might have. What they are searching is Ben Shapiro. If you lean with these conservative views now, for example, in an algorithm, are your views as important and your speech as important as Ben Shapiro? Well, actually now it just depends if you agree with him on everything. Because if you do, it's somewhat more important than the person who doesn't agree with you because now he's in that algorithm.
Yeah, and this is just really, I mean, we did talk about this quite a bit on the Intellectual Dark Web episode. So, there's just like so many layered issues here. Right. And it starts at the concept of free speech. If we want to have a democracy, then we need to be able to talk to each other. And we're not. That's not happening right now. That is not what our country is. We can't, you're listening to this podcast, but if Mark Zuckerberg put out a rebuttal tomorrow, not that he would ever hear this, but, theoretically, he'd have like 10 billion times the amount of listens or views than we would ever get. And that's not, and I'm not even saying that like I'm bitter about that, although I am. But like, that's just like, we're not in a equal conversation. Because I can tell you, for the lucky people who are listening to this and are not Mark Zuckerberg, for example, like his whole
Guys.
Yeah, thanks. His whole take on the First Amendment is wrong. He said like most of the civil rights movement in the 60s was based on the First Amendment, and that's just false. It was based on the Equal Protection Clause. It was based on the laws that were passed as a result of the Civil War. So that's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? That's the idea that we need to restructure now and put more regulation on the states and on businesses so they stop discriminating against minorities. What is that? Of course, that's related to free speech, but if anything, the people talking about free speech are more interested in helping out racists. And in the 60s, it was about stopping racists. So I don't even like that's a perfect example of like a person who has way too much power and way too much of a voice using it for really, really wacky things that is not like not valuable to society at all for him to be able to just misinform you. So,
well, and that's where I think it's important that we figure out a plan on a federal or government level as to helping outline for these corporations what they should be doing on some degree. I totally agree that we shouldn't be censoring online speech, but there should be some sort of maybe guidelines or something for these corporations, because it is like, Mark Zuckerberg at the end of the day, I don't think gives a shit that much about politics. He cares whatever he's going to get more money in. And that's probably the
well, because because his platform is largely conservative. He's just giving them what they want. Like, I agree.
Right.
I doubt he cares that much if a neoliberal or a conservative gets in office. Like, Joe Biden is not going to hurt his bottom line.
Right.
He's just not,
Yeah.
he's never going to do that. And that's why he's actually getting a lot of donations right now from Wall Street. And well, Wall Street's a bad example, but a lot of corporations, are donating to Joe Biden. I mean, I think there's actually a capitalist argument for Joe Biden, which is that like he's better at hiding how bad things are than
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
So anyway, that's the first problem is if we can't even talk to each other, then democracy is fundamentally flawed. If only the people who already have power get to maintain their power through speech, then we're fucked. The next problem is that even before a lot of these problems that we see with social media and the Citizens United decision that allowed unlimited spending in our campaigns is we already had structural problems in place with the way our government works in the first place. Is like this whole idea, like we talked about with the Senate. And so like we have layer upon layer of like, no, okay, first we don't even get to talk to each other. Second is even if we did get to talk to each other, the government isn't beholden to us because the way it's structured is that it gives a disproportionate amount of power to conservative people in rural states. And then three, now we get into the Citizens United problem and the social media problem, layer that on top, which is that, now the most powerful voices are heard not only in the public sphere, but also in government. And they have an unlimited ability to dictate who gets to be president. Yeah, I mean, most of our listeners are aware of this, but the problem, that's why I think when he says free speech is dead, he says The Curious Death of Free Speech is the name of his book. It's very accurate. Like any notion you have of a kind of free exchange of ideas or whatever the fuck Ben Shapiro is trying to peddle yeah. It's a fucking flaw unless you're down for like, let's try to create a society where more people are heard. And like you said, Decatur, which I think is actually perfect, which is that we need to create a society where the corporations don't just have like an unfettered right to drown out everyone else's voice.
Right.
You know what I mean? Both in the public sphere and in politics.
Right. Which I think you could honestly find a lot of people on the right who would agree with that, mainly because they think that it's skewered in the opposite direction right now, which would be just, wrong. But I do think you could get a lot of people on board with that because I do think no one thinks that there's no bias in these sort of things. And I don't even think that necessarily, like we just said with Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or whoever these CEOs of these social media companies or any of this shit is, I don't think they're as partisan as just these AI robots that do the work for them. And it's just coincidence, but either way, it needs to be solved. I mean, I think, what's the guy running against Pelosi? I always forget his name.
Shahid.
Yeah, Shahid Buttar. And obviously there's some other controversies there with him, but a problem that happened months ago is just him talking about the Patriot Act on YouTube, for example. 2 or 3 interviews got pulled off the internet right away. YouTube just took them off completely, and that was because the AI algorithm that was set, hearing certain words, seeing certain tags, and right out the bat, it's being taken away. And to me, like that's a huge problem of free speech because there's no context and you're already silencing. But this idea that Facebook or YouTube or whoever can just let off Stickshammer 666, for example, a YouTuber who complains about free speech all the time, who is just an alt-right, shit posting troll for the most part. He's made his fortune on YouTube, and now he's starting to get demonetized for talking about ethno-nationalism and being a Holocaust denier. And this idea that we can just demonetize and everything's fine, he thinks that's too far. And I think this is where the polarization comes from. He thinks that's too far. And his base says, well, this is atrocious. And we on the left say it's atrocious that, YouTube's not doing anything. And he's still in the algorithm with a Ben Shapiro, with a Jordan Peterson, with a fucking Joe Rogan.
Yep. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that, this is a really complicated issue. It's not clear to me what the answer is. Like we said, getting the government involved, I think it's okay to have the government involved in truth versus not truth. And I'll explain that in a second. And I think I might be able to sell you on it a little bit. I don't think it should be absolute, but on this idea of like what speech is good, what political speech is like dangerous and hateful and harmful. I mean, the argument has gone both ways. No matter what side of the political aisle you're on, abolitionists were called hateful. Palestinian supporters or people in solidarity with Palestine, they're called hateful and dangerous, and that it's going to lead to violence and all this other stuff. So the same arguments are made on both sides, and that's what's tough. Is it's just whoever is in power that gets to decide which version of that argument is right. So I am kind of still in favor, very much still in favor of the government keeping its hands off the content of political speech, unless that content get borderlines on fraud. And once we start talking about fraud and deception, that's a totally different thing. And this is why I think I might be able to sell you on it a little bit, because we already do this in so many areas of life. We just, for some reason, in one of the most important areas of life, don't, and that's in politics. So like I gave the example when we were talking in the interview, is in a private business dealing, or if I'm on Facebook doing false advertisement, trying to defraud people into giving me money for a product I don't even have, or a product that isn't what I say it is. Or if I'm a restaurant and I'm advertising a food, but this food actually is very harmful, and it has toxins and it causes cancer, and I don't talk about that, or I lie about it. These are facts that are capable of verification. We just have to kind of come to a place where we agree on, well, who's right, and how do we know what's right? And that's a difficult issue, or it only now is, because of social media has muddled what the truth is. But we have always had like a mechanism for that. We had you have entities like the FCC and other government agencies that can look into false advertisement. We also have courtrooms, and courtrooms for hundreds and hundreds of years have been our best way of sorting out fact from fiction. Now, I'm a lawyer, and I can tell you that courtrooms are actually a pretty awful way in some instances to find out fact from fiction, and I'm all in favor of reforming how they work. But they sometimes do get to the right answer, and at least it's one thing we've kind of agreed on, is that at least we do have this neutral forum where we can go sort out fact from fiction. So it's not that we're incapable of regulating fraud in political discourse, which I think is a really important thing to do. It's just like right-wingers are acting like we're incapable of.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, Steve. As more of a theoretical, for example, courts do figure out, truth in some matter. I don't think the average, person in the population really looks to the courts though for any say on anything, clearly, because. Well, no,
I'm just talking about as an example.
Right. But and I'm not saying for that. I'm just saying for theoretically, do you think there should be sort of, how, the UN or Geneva, they have these, truth council. Should there just be some sort of truth council for?
That sounds a lot. Obviously my initial reaction is that sounds a lot like 1984 Ministry of Truth, right? That sounds like a dystopian idea, but it's not far off from what I'm talking about, in the sense that the idea is this: it would have to be politically detached and neutral somehow, and we'd have to put in structural places. I don't even believe that's the case for courts a lot of the time. A lot of them, depending on what state you're in and how the courts are set up, there are political ramifications for decisions, and that actually not just affects the judges, but the juries and the lawyers and everybody. And so it's hard to create a system that's somehow isolated from the ramifications of their decision. I don't even know that that's possible, but there are ways we can structure some kind of government entity that gives a voice, due process to everybody involved, and that we can try to structure it in a way that is better at seeking truth than Zuckerberg's solution, which is, I'm just going to pretend like that's impossible.
Well, right. And I don't necessarily, I see what you mean by the 1984, but having some sort of independent council commission for something. Because the fact is that if there was even some sort of .gov to go to, and I get your point, it gets a little authoritarian in some ways, but that being said, is it much different than what we have now with Facebook? It's just corporate censoring the speech right now. And I don't think it's that much different. And
you're right. Right now, we've mentioned now multiple times, is that doing nothing is not a neutral decision, because what that does is replace the void of power, the vacuum of power, with corporations. But anyway, this is a really roundabout way of saying is that our government doesn't actually represent us, and we don't usually have the ability to speak in an equal way to corporations. Our country is completely run by corporations, and both in speech and in the political sphere. And that's kind of what I got out of this book in a way. And I think it's okay for us to talk about changing the way that works, so we actually have real freedom and not just the illusion of freedom by deregulation.
Right. Yeah, I think this book definitely pointed out well that there are a lot of free speech issues we have in this country, and none of them are what we hear every day of what the free speech issues actually are. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from this.
Agreed.
Yeah, this book. And that's really, I guess, probably the best place for me to end it. Hey, Steve, real quick. Let me clear up just a couple things here.
Oh, okay.
One, I've been just seeing since it's about to be out, so I just got to get this out of my system so people hear this soon. There's a whole thing going around about Joe Biden rubbing dogs when they have boners.
What?
I just want to point out where that started from.
Wait, this is a thing? I haven't seen this.
Yes. So people are saying like, oh, Joe Biden.
I believe it.
Talked about, how it's like a weird thing because he's rubbing dogs and they get boners, but he doesn't know if he should stop because the dog's happy. I just want to point out that was not Joe Biden who said that. That was Joe Budden on Joe Budden's podcast, and the Trumpers just ran with it. So
what? So
yes.
They're literally this is the perfect
So
example.
they're characterizing a 42-year-old black man as Joe Biden and mixing it up.
Well, they don't know the difference. Was there anything else to clear up? Because that was really shocking. That was number one. I just want to get that out because I saw a couple of the comrades under 1K hashtag also share that. I'm like, guys, no, this is from a rap podcast. You're getting this all mixed up. And he raises a good question. Do you stop rubbing the dog?
It's an important question.
Yeah.
And that's why freedom of speech, right? There's so many avenues. We need to figure out the answers. That's one of them, I guess.
Should he be free to talk about dog boners? It's up to you. It's up to you. You decide, America.
Like and subscribe and let us know in the comments. What's our email, I wanted to say, so anyone could message us, email us, things like that.
superpoliticsshow@gmail.com. Now, remember, I'm going to put it in the description so you don't have to remember it. Never mind. Yeah. Okay. Where is it? It might be up here. We don't know. Is it in the corner? How do these work?
Right here. You can put it right there. Right over my lazy ass. You don't have to watch it all day.
Oh, man. Well, what else do you have, man? I mean, our country is screwed. We have to fix some of these things. We have to create a culture. We have to push back on this stupid shit about we can't even touch speech, even if it's a blatant lie. Yeah. We have to push back on the idea that free speech is the only civil right that matters, because obviously there's other things that really matter, like equality and equal protection and racial justice and, economic humanity. Justice, class justice, people's humanity, right? Like I care a lot about the fact that like I'm not free at work. I mean, who is, right? I mean, I'm not complaining about my job. I love them. But what I am saying is that like in general, you're not like you're someone's employee more often than not. And so you're not free there. I mean, there's all these times where we're not free to speak. So what is this notion of free speech that we think we have, right? We don't actually have it. I want it. I want a real free speech. I want real freedom. I don't want this bullshit the right is trying to tell you. Yeah. Don't ever let the right tell you this freedom of speech shit is partisan, because they don't understand what speech actually is. Agreed. All right. Let's leave it at that. Thanks. Great. Thanks everybody. Thanks for listening. Yep.